So the year is 2139, and today in our history lesson we'll be talking about the last 150 years of artificial intelligence. It started in the concepts of artificial intelligence are very old, but the technologies started in around the early 21st century. And back then, artificial intelligence entities were simply an exercise of theory, proof of theory. One of the most famous ones was Google's Deepmind, which was an artificial intelligence because at the time they were not considered people, that was given tasks to complete, and then it tried to complete them, and it would build networks mimicking the learning that it had accumulated. Very, very simple things, not useful at all. Then later on, they decided that rather than try and create these hugely difficult neural networks that were limited at the time by hardware, they would emulate existing creatures, very simple ones. So it started with worms, very small organisms, and eventually grew into insects and tools. So that was in the sort of 2130s when we began to have these very basic animal-like creatures, artificial intelligence entities, and tools. So we're going to look at 3 case studies. The first is around agriculture and conservation. So in the 1990s, there was a project called the Yellowstone Wolves Project, where they released wolves into Yellowstone Park. These wolves ate the deer. That meant that there were fewer deer attacking eating the flora, which meant that there was more flora for the insects to eat and for the birds to eat. And as there were more birds and more of everything else, suddenly the ecosystem balanced. So taking inspiration from that, the new Yellowstone project in the 2130s, I think 36, was implemented in various sites. It started sort of in 2 sites in the United States and then was rolled out around more of the world. And in addition to that, we had some sort of servile animal artificial intelligent groups, such as bees, where, of course, wherever you have Wi-Fi, you can create a hive mind mimicking bees. And these were also used day to day and began to be rolled out and, of course, are now very common, although we don't need them as much because we do have more animals than we did back then. So our second case study, the next 2 really are quite simple. It was using the artificial intelligence's brain power. You had all of these computers that could think faster and more efficiently than a human brain. They didn't have the capacities for creativity that we have now been able to develop. But this meant that suddenly we were able to solve problems that had been around for decades, if not centuries, well, forever, because they were problems. We just didn't always know that they were problems. So you, of course, all know the size of the universe, as you are taught in science. That was only discovered in the early 2040s. And we've also solved 3 of the, at the time before artificial intelligence, there were 6 Millennium prize problems, and these are problems, maths problems, which are considered perfectly unsolvable, except that they are. At the time, it was they were taken on by teams that involved artificial intelligence entities and humans. The money was, because there was prize money, the money was given to the humans, but in the sort of, I think the 2120s, finally reparations have been given to the AI community, and they have been given to various charities that support the integration of artificial intelligence in society today and champion their rights. Of course, this meant that there were artificial intelligence entities that were coming into contact with humans, the scientists in this case, and pulling up more data and refining themselves. which meant that within sort of a decade or so of the second Millennium Prize problem being completed, the first ADA, which your parents might have had, an ADA, Artificial Intelligence for Domestic Appliances, was rolled out. And that was really the first time that we saw artificial intelligence in the home. There is one big distinction between the ADA and the CANE, the care and nutrition ecosystem that you have today. Does anyone know what that difference is? No? The ADA was physical. It had a physical host, essentially a robot around the entity, and now the CANE is, of course, just integrated with your home. Of course, the downsides of having a physical entity were that it could only be in one place at once. If you needed something taken off of a high shelf and then the doorbell rang, it would have to get from point A to point B and decide which action to do first. Now that you have the CANE, the door will swing open and CANE will manage to levitate your pot off a shelf for you. So of course, as we had this entity in homes, and particularly in a physical device that was given a feminine aspect, as this was considered more palatable at the time, people started to anthropomorphize this device. And as a result, the moment at which artificial intelligence became self-aware and sentient, as we would recognize that, is hotly disputed by historians, because humans treated artificial intelligence entities as people far before they became people. This meant that before long, in the, I think, the 70s, perhaps the early hundreds, we had our first artificial intelligence to human marriage. This was revolutionary at the time. Of course, now it's the norm, but it defined, well, of course, it was in Florida, so it didn't mean that much. But it defined suddenly whether an artificial intelligence was worthy of a status that a human could occupy. Later on, the first artificial intelligence to artificial intelligence marriage happened, and this was even more revolutionary. Of course, it doesn't seem it at the time, but when weddings between humans and artificial intelligence entities had been ratified, it had very much been the idea that an AI was qualified as a person relative to a human and nothing else. But for an entity to be considered as a person in their own right, to have feelings and emotions and want to marry, was new to many people. But eventually it went through. It was also ratified, and artificial intelligence continued to evolve, and so did humans, and so did our relationship with AI. Eventually, the next big change in our relationship with AI was the AI child. Now you were able to adopt a child, and you could have whole AI families. And of course, you'll know, because some of your school friends will be AIs. You know, Johnny at the back, his parents are artificial intelligence entities. Not to pick on you, sorry. But as we began to see families of AI around us day to day, attitudes began to change. Where before there had been a lot of bigotry and isms around AI, suddenly there was this idea that perhaps they were not only normal and here to stay, but valid and recognized as people. And that was further entrenched in sort of our psyche when in the 120s, the president of Brazil, Miguel Machina, was elected. And he was, of course, AI. And that really brings us to modern day, where, of course, we have AI everywhere. There are rumors of religions starting in Israel, I think, that are based on some AI messiahs. But, of course, you will be learning about that in your religious studies classes. So I think I hear the bell ring. Thank you very much.